Now we're moving on to the thank you to the conversation part of the evening, and please start thinking about questions that you want to bring up. But to have this dialogue, I want to invite Anja Obminska to the stage. She's a science journalist at Sydsvenskan, based in Malmö, and as a reporter, she's covered a wide range of topics, mainly focused on technology, innovation, and medicine. Before joining Sydsvenskan, Anja worked at Ny Teknik. Please welcome Anja Obminska and also James Bridle.
Yeah. Yeah, James, I wanted to pick up a bit from the ending. You were talking about us maybe more being like with the time lapse and the plans, actually not only looking at the videos, but trying to understand it for ourselves and trying to be, make ourselves. And I think you have an interesting example in your book where you actually yourself made a self-driving car. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've kind of worked with AI for quite a long time. That's part of where all of this comes from. I actually kind of studied it properly academically like 20 years ago when it was just falling out of fashion the last time, before it came back. Though it's very interesting that actually nothing's really changed. We've just got more powerful computers and more people's personal data to play with. But the underlying maths hasn't changed very much in 20 years. But as an artist, I'd been sort of investigating it a little bit more to kind of poke it, to see what was interesting to be done with it. And I'd done a couple of projects where, I deployed various systems to do interesting, clever things, but I didn't really feel like I understood it very well. But what I had realized was that I was very intrigued by the notion of AI as being a collaborator, as a kind of cooperation process, rather than this combative, competitive kind of approach that seems to underlie most of the AI, like this kind of game-playing stuff I talked about. And I'm also fascinated for the similar reasons with just the very idea of self-driving cars. Because like AI, I'm always fascinated by technologies that seem to go from crazy speculative science fiction to everyday, almost boring, like that. And of course, there's loads of research that's happened around them, and people have been working on them for decades, but for most of us, that transition happens very quickly. And one of the problems with that transition happening very quickly is there's not a lot of public discussion around it, and most people don't really understand how it works. And it becomes part of the basic frameworks of our lives without any public discussion about the good of it, whether we want it, these kinds of things. And so I decided to train a self-driving car. It was just a regular rental car, but I fitted it out with a bunch of cameras, and I wrote some software on my phone that I stuck to the steering wheel that recorded like how the steering wheel turned and the speed of the car, and then I went for a drive in the mountains. And that's actually how you train a self-driving car. Like, they are just driven around on the roads watching humans. And so I tried to train it a little bit differently. The main thing I did was that I basically taught it to get lost, because I thought that was more interesting than like getting in a car and like pressing that button and then sitting back. Like, you'd actually go on a kind of adventure together of discovery. But like more specifically, I understood a little bit about this thing of collaborating, of seeing the AI as being its own being in a certain sense. And so another thing that I did was this sounds really mean, but it came from a happy place, is that I built a trap for it. Using a bag of salt for black magic reasons, I drew a large circle, solid circle on the ground, and then a large dashed circle outside that. And in the European law, a solid line and a dashed line means no entry. So that when you create a circle of it, if a car that's just based on driving itself and obeying its own laws enters that circle, it's impossible to leave. Which was fun, but what I was actually doing was I was trying to find something. I was trying to find a shared space with the machine. I was looking for a thing that both humans and the machines could sense, which in this case was sight. The cars have cameras. They're looking at the world, and we're looking at the world as well. And so this circle, this trap, was actually a way of making visible a shared space of awareness. Like I was talking about with the plants, talking about the fact that we share a world, but it's almost unknowable to us. Well, what is the world that we share with the self-driving car? And it is the street, it's the markings. That's what they're looking for and what we can both see. And so this quite like antagonistic thing of trapping the car was also about understanding how the car experienced the world and then trying to share in that in some way, which is the classic kind of idea of the Umwelt, which I talk about in the book, which is like, what is the individual construction of the world that's done by any particular organism? Well, these machines have Umwelts too as well, which for me means they have a kind of claim on the world, that relates to ours in various ways.
But when you talk about us getting more involved and try to understand, do you recommend people go as far as just to try to make like a self-driving car? What could we actually do?
Like, go ahead. It's not that hard. You can download most of the software from the internet. And I've always been a very strong believer that anyone is capable of doing these things. Like in all of my work, I'm very much based on being a kind of enthusiastic amateur about it. That's why I talk about the stick example. I don't know whether I explained it very well. But it's really important to understand what a powerful experience it is. Because you do it oneself. And this applies to, for the last kind of decade of my work, that's largely focused on kind of computational complexity and the political and social effects of network technologies. One of the things that I've always said is that people basically need to understand how computers work better. Because if you have an understanding of how machines function, you have an ability to read the world, to understand how they affect your life, that changes your own agency, that allows you to do things in your life, to have more control over your life, and also, particularly importantly, psychologically, to feel like you have more control over your life. That is something that we mostly lack. And so, I've realized in this kind of ecological turn that my work and my life has taken, that really applies to pretty much all experience. Turns out everything I thought was just in computers applies quite more broadly to our experiences of the world, and particularly this thing of like you have to do things for yourself, and you have to embody these knowledges and awarenesses, and you have to have these experiences yourself for them to be meaningful. So whether or not everyone else goes and builds their own self-driving car, I still recommend people learn to code, not to get a job as a programmer, God forbid, but just because it gives you more control over the stuff around you in the same way that growing a garden does. Not as a form of control, but as a form of relationship.
Yeah, and you mentioned examples of artificial intelligence, and I think many of us reading and listening to the news, and me writing about the news, or for the news, many of our examples are from big corporations. But do you have any counterexamples of artificial intelligence that maybe most of us don't hear as much about?
Yeah, I mean, there are really interesting efforts to do things somewhat differently. There's things that kind of call themselves open source or kind of non-profit or distributed in various ways, but because of the resources required for AI, like AI is very expensive to do. You need a lot of computers. Means it's basically really hard for average, normal, like non-corporate people to actually be involved in this. But there's some efforts underway to think kind of really radically different. I think they're worth paying attention to. There's an organization in Canada called Indigenous AI, which is really doing some of the kind of thinking along these lines of asking, firstly, what a kind of non-corporate, non-European, non-colonial thinking about intelligence and relationships would look like when applied to thinking about AI, but also thinking about how non-Western, non-European cosmologies of relationships with other beings affect that thinking. So, what if our conception of AI wasn't modeled upon essentially pets, as in like subservient animals, of something essentially subhuman, but perhaps on animals that also have relationships with us and are as valid and important and are recognized as their own beings and subjects. A really good practical example is Te Rawa Media in New Zealand. Te Rawa Media is a small radio station, well, quite with a huge range, serving mostly Maori community and broadcasting in the Maori language. And they wanted to digitize this huge archive they had of like 30 years of recordings of Maori speakers. In order to digitize it, they needed speech recognition. And no one's made good Maori speech recognition because none of the big corporations thought it would make them any money. So they built the one themselves in much the same kind of approach that I went about doing the self-driving car. And they just kind of copied and pasted bits of software they found from the internet. I mean, they're better programmers than me, to be clear. They're good at what they do. But they figured out how to do it, and they've successfully built their own speech recognition engine. But a couple of really important things that matter about that is the first thing they did is that they worked with their community to do it. So they basically contacted every single kind of Maori community organization in New Zealand and asked people to submit their own voice samples, like to read sentences out loud so that the machine had like a database of words and sounds related so that they could then do all the stuff that didn't have it already written down. And people did that because they wanted this process to happen within their own community. And the end result is also that it's owned by the community. And subsequently, when other companies came and either asked to use that speech recognition system or to get people to contribute, more spoken things for other language models that would then be owned by companies, they both could and did say no, because they saw it, and very much unsensible review, as essentially another form of colonialism. That this can be called digital colonialism, is essentially these companies were coming to take a cultural artifact, their actual language, and essentially then turn it into something they could sell back to them. But because they went through and did this process themselves, they own that. And the kind of AI that they work with is part of their culture and their cultural heritage and is owned by the community. And so like other models absolutely exist for doing this.
You have so many, I don't know if fun is the right word, but I think it's quite fun since I've written a lot from the technology point of view. I think one thing that was interesting and that we've talked about are the hyperaccumulators. We talk a lot about, cars driven by electricity and mining for minerals, through technology, and we think that's the maybe logical way. But can you talk about what these plans are?
Yeah, so I would have got to the end of the presentation, but I talked too much, so I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about it. Because this was a really beautiful thing that happened, because it happened very close to where the story started up in Ipirus, which was, a kind of horrible experience of discovering this AI attacking the Earth. For the last couple of years, I've been working with some researchers up in Ipirus, like within 50 kilometers of the site that I showed you, who are working with a class of plants called hyperaccumulators, which are a whole class of different species that have evolved a special skill in various ways that means they're capable of living within soils that contain what are usually considered to be contaminants, particularly like naturally occurring metals. Northern Greece and Albania, there's a lot of these soils that are very naturally rich in nickel. There's a lot of nickel in the ground, which makes it not very good for agriculture. But these plants basically have evolved in this place to survive in nickel-rich soils by drawing up the metal into their plants and leaves, into their stems and leaves. And there was a lot of research into these plants, which exist in different conditions all around the world, in the 90s by mining companies, because they realized they could, if they found the right plants, they could basically plant them on polluted old mines, and these plants would essentially clean the soil by by drawing all this stuff out of the ground. It's called phytoremediation. It really works, and it's a brilliant thing, and it's being deployed in various ways. The ones in Greece are doing something quite slightly differently, which is called phyto or agro-mining, which is that they're actually growing these plants for the metal that's already there. And so what they're doing is they're growing fields of these plants, and then they're harvesting them. And you can get the metal out, and you get several kilograms of metal per square meter from these little shrubs. And the roots stay in the ground and grow again and sequester carbon, and you burn the plants to generate heat and then get this metal out of them. And it's basically an incredibly extraordinary non-destructive way of mining. It will never approach and shouldn't approach the kind of metal needs we have at the moment. It would be disastrous if we had a kind of monoculture in this way. We'd just repeat the same old problems. But for me, it shows firstly that there are other ways of doing things that we do in incredibly damaging ways most of the time, like industrial mining. But it's also an example of this kind of knowledge that's embodied in the natural world. The plants in Epirus are three different types. There's one called Alyssum morale, which grows kind of all around the Mediterranean. There's one called Bornemorella emerginata, which only grows in Greece and Albania. And then the third plant they're trialing is called Bornemorella tymphea, which is named for Mount Tymphy, which is the highest mountain of the Epirus range. And that only grows within a 50-kilometer radius of this mountain. And so these plants, they're endemics. They grow specifically in this place. They've evolved a knowledge of that place that we have something to learn from. For me, it's this really powerful example of this knowledge that's embedded and embodied by other species that we're only just beginning to kind of recognize and become aware of.
I'm going to ask 2 questions before we'll let people in the audience ask questions, so I hope you have some. First of all, how can artificial intelligence help us become better stewards of our planet or not?
Like I said in the talk, it depends how we choose to use it and what we choose to put those ends towards. While it remains, like everything else, remains entirely captured by profit-driven intentions, corporations in various forms. It's going to carry on doing whatever corporations do. There's no surprise. It's not some magic thing. It's just going to be a tool that gets put to use. There are, as I said, many counterexamples. But as I said also, to me, the most valuable thing is not really what AI or what use we put AI to materially, but how it stimulates us to think about broader relations between technology and ourselves and the more than human world.
So for all of us that feel like we need to act in some way, from hearing everything you talk about, and we feel that we do something to get a better future, a better world. Where should we start?
I don't have simple, easy answers to that. But the thing that has changed me utterly is quite simply a change in where I choose to put my awareness. I've gone in the last 5 or 6 years from being someone who didn't look up that much from the computer screen into someone who now stops on the street and just looks at trees for quite a long time, because I've come to understand them as being their own living beings, and they've just become endlessly fascinating to me. And something has been transformed by the thinking that I've done about these relationships that it's possible to have. And so obviously I would say that that's what we all should do, and that will sort of magically... I don't think that's going to magically change anything. But I can promise anyone that it is something that we can all do, and that it changes the quality of one's life utterly. And it is one of the many necessary steps towards making larger scale political changes that are an entirely different set of questions.
Questions from the audience? Yes. And you can, if it's okay, you can say your name and then ask the question.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lila Lee Morrison, and I'm a researcher at the University of Southern Denmark, but live in Malmö. And I come from the Department of Art History and Visual Culture. So I have a question. It was such a wonderful talk, and it was so enlightening and eye-opening. And I don't want to be too greedy, but I have a two-part question. One is that the first question I have is I really appreciated this idea of embodied intelligence, and when you had brought up the sort of negative uses of AI, it was often concerning sort of this sense of form of intelligence of AI that's related to sort of mathematical computation of probabilities. And then when you bring up the kind of positive use of AI and technology today, you brought up the computer vision and the sense of the visual and the ability to make things visible. So I was wondering, in terms of your research and work, how much of a hierarchy there is in the visual sense in terms of possibility and positivity of the use of AI. And then the second question I have is that many of the things that have been brought up in terms of nature and natural intelligence is something, and the ways that plants and animals can sense and know, are something that I feel like has been studied by biologists and different forms of scientists in the natural sciences. And so there has been an awareness before now about these other forms of intelligence. But I wonder, is your argument that this type of study of natural life needs to be more broader in the general public, like outside of these specialized canons of biology and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, those are both kind of questions about various hierarchies, ultimately, I think. But thank you for them. Humans prioritize vision particularly, right? It's kind of our most, it's the sense that we default to. And so, yeah, we tend to prioritize it inside the systems that we build, and they tend to be the ways in which those systems communicate with us. I don't know if I agree, but I think we perhaps agree that is a problem, particularly when it comes to thinking about other forms of senses, and that we definitely need to think with other beings who sense in very different ways if we're to understand the world in really different ways. Because, yeah, it shapes the way we develop our systems, and it also really shapes our understanding of other creatures. So another of the good examples of like the weird intelligence tests that humans do is a thing called the mirror test, where we put various animals in front of the mirror and try and figure out if they recognize themselves as being, if they recognize themselves, i.e. if they have a sense of themselves as an individual, as a unique being in the world, which is one of those things that we think is really important. But also that it tends, because we use mirrors, it tends to really prioritize the faces. So for a long time, lots of monkeys weren't regarded as having this form of self-awareness because they just use the mirror to look at their butts. And it's like, but butts are really, really important to monkeys. That's actually how they mostly signal it. Maybe they're more important faces. So like this visuality creates all of these like problems. And yeah, like I can't think of any really good examples off the top of my head, but there's a lot of different sensing possibilities that I think we need to be attuned to, both for like to build more interesting machines and to like understand how the world is being experienced by other creatures. The second part is why this. There's one problem I think with a lot of the scientific stuff is that it tends to be hugely siloed, both with its own discipline and within the sciences generally. It's like this incredible gift as someone who writes about science quite a lot, as a non-academic, as someone who's not within a department or within a discipline, because there's just so much of it. And if you tell other people about it, they think you're amazing. And I'm like, no, I've been doing this for ages. It's just all in these scientific papers that only other scientists read. And that's a real problem across the board. And it's a problem of the division between the arts and the humanities, and it's really stuck there. But I think there's also a larger, particularly when it comes to these questions of intelligence, there's a real reticence to talk about intelligence really just like in the way that I do, because again, I've got no affiliation. I don't have to like get published in journals. So I can talk about it in this very loose way, which tends to annoy scientists and religious people and all kinds of people. But I think it's really important to do, because I think one of the reasons we don't do it enough is because there is a kind of inbuilt, quite primal, even existential human concern that by extending intelligence to other beings, we somehow reduce ourselves. And that's true of a lot of our kind of interactions with species. And it's true of all our definitions of kind of, and it extends to things like rights between humans, of course, historically and in the present in all kinds of ways, that in some way by giving others respect for their subjecthood, political rights, all kinds of things, that somehow removes something from us. And you see it happening with intelligence, you see it happening in all other kinds of ways. And we really need to think about ways in which we are capable of extending acknowledgement, respect, rights, and other things beyond our particular clique or beyond our particular species in ways that do not devalue that thing, but simply make it more interesting and broad, because that's my attitude. It's like you can't, there's this argument that essentially goes that if you say this thing is intelligent, you basically lessen what intelligence means. But I don't see it that way. I see that this expands and it makes it richer and more interesting and more full of possibilities. That's quite hard to do within academic disciplines. And it's the example I gave of the mimosa plants that closed up, the ones that have memory, was a really interesting one, because it took a long time to get that research published for various reasons. But one of the problems was not just like academic conservatism, but was also like they didn't know where to put that knowledge, right? Because does this belong in a journal of like botany or the journal of consciousness? Like there wasn't a space in which to put this new form of knowledge because it didn't fit within our existing taxonomies. And so these kind of new forms of awareness, they take a while to come out, but they take a while to be translated and kind of thought and put into discussion, and that's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, James and Nia. My name is Paulo. Nice to meet you. I'm very interested in your thoughts behind the systemic changes that we must make in order for this type of conversations to emerge. Because I think sitting here, we all have a certain privilege and a certain level of education that allows us to have the space to think about these things. If I'm financially secure and I can go out and explore nature, read different books, buy them, have access to this information, that allows me to reevaluate my relationships with myself, with the planet, and etc. Not many of us have this privilege, or we perhaps haven't had the opportunity to be given the necessary tools and skill sets in order to navigate this abstract world how you are doing it. So my question is, what are the changes that you think we need to make as a society in our systems, in our infrastructures, from our political systems, from our educational systems, from our corporate systems? Sorry if I'm just going kind of deep into the rabbit hole here, but what are the changes that you see are necessary and the incentives that we need to change in order for this type of planetary and multidisciplinary intelligence to truly emerge? I'm
not going to try and answer that. I'm sorry. I think it's a reasonable question. It's just a very, very big one. And, all technological and other problems at sufficient scale are essentially political problems. So I understand why that surrounds this discussion that we're having. And I'm not going to try and answer it, but what I'm going to give is another example, another story. Sorry, that's what I have to give of ways of doing things radically differently that are completely accessible to us at the moment. That was one of the things that really inspired my thinking. I write quite a lot in the book about the power of randomness. And the reason I write about it is it seems like a way of us bringing forms of intelligence together that has usefulness beyond the human. But it starts with a thing called citizens' assemblies, which are practiced in various places under various names. I'm sure there's probably been versions of them here. I know there have been in Denmark and Poland and a few other countries, trials of them. It was particularly well-known exercise, and it was done in Ireland a few years ago. And so what happened was that the Irish government created this thing called a citizens' assembly, and they charged it with thinking about and making recommendations about a series of problems that the government itself was really struggling to address. And those were things like abortion rights, abortion access, climate change, the environment, how to address issues of an aging population, a couple of other ones. And what they did was they took 100 people at random from across the entirety of the population. They basically did a lottery on the voter rolls, and they got 100 people from the entire population. They put them in a hotel for a series of weekends with a little kind of civil servant staff, and then they had presentations from experts on like a range of these topics. And the theory behind this is a thing called diversity trumps ability, which is the idea that for like complex, novel problems that we're struggling with, the most useful and interesting solutions are found not by a narrow group of experts who, because these problems are new, like the expertise doesn't actually necessarily apply, but by bringing together the widest possible range of experiences and life histories and ways of thinking, ways of doing intelligence, which vary among humans as much as they vary beyond species, and getting them to think together. And the result of this in Ireland were extraordinary. The first one they did was abortion, which is, has historically been the most divisive issue in Irish public life. It becomes so divisive that basically most politicians would not even venture an opinion on it because they would immediately lose their seats, basically. And yet this group of 100 random people, through a kind of deliberative design process, recommended that it should go to a referendum. And because they'd been created in a kind of binding thing by the government, that referendum happened, and it resulted in the 73% vote to legalize abortion access in Ireland. Complete change, which most people had thought they wouldn't even see in their lifetimes. Right? And what's happening here is really interesting, because not only did 100 random people, right, in these divided, times when none of us can agree with anything, we've all lost faith in politics. 100 people came together in consensus from across all walks of life and managed to make work together towards a consensus. They also then proposed something that was more radical than any politicians thought possible. And they did this on every single one of the issues that were invited. They did the same thing with proposing new environmental legislation. They agreed on stuff that politicians were too scared to put forward because they thought it was too radical. And it went into law. So this extraordinary thing happened when you brought together these different forms of thinking. And there's various experiments like that underway, but it's one of those things that it's kind of like, look, we know it works. Let's just start putting it to work at scale. But obviously it's threatening to those in power, so they're not going to let us. But the kind of through line I would just add to that is that there's a kind of follow-on realization, which is also that if you acknowledge that the best way to address these kind of novel, thorny, difficult, complex problems that we're facing at scale is by bringing together as many different forms of intelligence as you can muster from across the complete spectrum. And at the same time, you acknowledge that intelligence exists beyond the human in multiple, interesting, and entangled ways. Then we have no choice but to push towards an inclusion of non-human intelligences in however forms we can access this, and I do have some thoughts on that, into our political processes. That we have to extend that kind of subjecthood in our decision-making and in our thinking beyond the human, which leads to a whole new set of interesting questions. But short-term, go vegan and overthrow the government is my answer.
Any more questions?
Thank you. I'm Gustav. I work for the City of Malmö Streets and Parks Department. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. And I was very inspired and kind of moved by your sort of the drive towards an increased empathy with other types of intelligence, and also with the idea of how to that we don't understand things until we understand them ourselves. And it seemed to me that we already have another method for this, essentially play. That we as human beings engage in understanding the world around us and recreating it in our minds and enacting it is something we do from when we're children. And so I was interested in hearing your thoughts about a culture of play as a driver towards increasing a culture of empathy towards other types of intelligence.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer for you, but I think it's a lovely way of framing like a way of thinking about our relationships as something that is inherently playful and experience-based, rather than being based on understanding. Because actually, yes, I don't have a good answer for what it would look like, but I'd like to pull out a little bit about why I think it's a really good question. It's because most of our, it's a good answer to a question that I hadn't been able to figure out before. So much of our relations with other beings are based on our attempts to understand them, which largely involves cutting them up into small pieces, which is just a really bad way of understanding things. And it's like an inherently destructive process. And there's something about like post-Enlightenment scientific ways of knowing the world that operate through destroying the thing they're trying to understand. I have problems with empathy as well, because I think empathy is also a mode of relating that is based on the necessity of understanding in a certain way that isn't always possible. Like, I don't know if it's possible to have empathy with a tree when we seem incapable of having empathy with people who live like in slightly distant countries. There's limits to that. But there is, my political answer to that is usually solidarity. You can have political relationships and relationships of respect and care without having to empathize, without having to know what it's like to be someone else, without having to imagine yourself into another body or being. You can just actually care about them and respect them. But I think play is the other half of that, quite possibly, because it's something that comes naturally, and it's. God, I'm trying to quote Wittgenstein. It's probably a really good idea. I can't even remember the quote. He says something about language being a form of play. It's a form of relating that puts us into a space of a different form of understanding that recognizes the thing that we are relating with as having its own subjecthood and being. That doesn't require us to understand it when our understanding is always a form of domination. As long as we're not playing chess. We got to think of what those games could be, but I think that's a very beautiful idea of how these relations might work.
Thank you. My name's Lara. I work for IKEA American living in Denmark. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really been a joy. Kind of riding off of this last question a bit, I'm curious your perspectives on art as a way of expanding our boundaries of understanding intelligence or accepting. A number of times your talk has reminded me of Solaris, one of my favorite science fiction books, or even Under the Skin, and I thought you probably have a good story related to art or some recommendations to push ourselves in thinking a different way.
Solaris is obviously a very good example of a description of a ultimately unknowable non-human intelligence in some description, and I think that's that's a big part of what art can do, is that it can provide these kind of descriptions that allow us to imagine in new ways what these encounters might be like, and sort of set the scene for them, I guess. I think there's a worrying trend in most of our popular imagination of those things, though, towards kind of essentially dystopias, that we seem better at creating fear-based scenarios around those encounters than hopeful ones. Though hopefully it might be possible to rethink that. There are various movements and currents underway in kind of science fiction and other disciplines that are trying to imagine, if not utopias, then at least kind of anti-dystopias, as the writer Kim Stanley Robinson has put it. That there's like we can still fight against those kind of bad imaginings. So there's the kind of representation and modeling of other relationships, other potential futures, both in genre and kind of generalized fiction, I guess. For me personally, I'm interested in more than just those kind of representations, but also in kind of interventions, and how we actually create models of those things. So an example of something like that would be the work of someone like the Dutch artist Jonas Staal, who in recent years, he started, one of the big parts of his practice for many years has been building parliaments. So he creates his own kind of representative communities. He's done this with banned political parties, for example, or he's done this with people from unrecognized nations, bringing together these kind of novel political assemblages. And in a couple of his most recent works, in particular, one of his recent works is a project called the Court for Intergenerational Climate Change, Intergenerational Climate Crimes, sorry, in which various actual lawyers and people, are giving evidence on the behalf of both extinct species and future generations of humans and non-humans, to try and create new legal frameworks in which the lives of those already made extinct and those yet unborn can be accounted for in the present and used to bring political pressure on kind of polluters and climate change in general. And that's a really powerful role. And for me, talk whatever as long as you like about what art is and therefore what the role of the artist is. But for me, it's always a space in which you can get creative with the rules of other people's disciplines, and you can shape things that possibly just can't be shaped with it. Art is where things go that don't really fit into anything else, most broadly. And so, like, really interesting things can and I think are being done there. And I like it when it gets political and kind of activisty and actually intervenes and like means what it says.
Do you have time for one last question?
Hi, my name is Kristin. I'm a communicator in hiatus, exploring transitions into a sustainable society and my internal transitions and so forth. But so my question or sort of philosophical thinking here is...
I'm really sorry, could you just wave so I can see where you are?
Here I am, okay. Up here, way
hi.
Back.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking it's sort of tempting to take the slime mold intelligence and the octopus intelligence and the birch tree intelligence and the intelligence of a Bangladeshi woman and a North American man and so forth, and just put it feed it to an AI and see what comes out and how all that combined intelligence, what it would give. Have you thought about that, and how would it be affected by the fact that it is a human computing that AI?
You mean to try and model those over like particular different forms of intelligence, or that the fact that they're kind of from different perspectives? I don't quite understand.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, could a human compute an AI that could sort of mimic the whole ecosystem of planet Earth?
That's a really interesting question. Because one of the problems with AI is that it tends to try and simulate a single mind. and particularly views a mind as something like encapsulated, or the phrase I think I used in the talk was like inside a head, when intelligence is always relational. In the book, I write a bit about some particularly weird experiments from the 1960s and 70s in cybernetics, which is a kind of branch of control theory and mathematics that tried to make machines with a very different conceptualization of intelligence. In particular, there was a guy called Stafford Beer who tried to build computers out of like algae and insects in ponds, but essentially and critically out of whole ecosystems, seeing intelligence as being something that lived in a system of relationships between creatures rather than as being like a model of a single creature. And his and others' realization was that real intelligent computing could only be achieved by computers that had some kind of relationship with the world, where there was this kind of back and forth. The original sin of computers is like Alan Turing's definition of one type of computation back in the 1930s, which he called the automatic machine, and we call the Turing machine, which is this all of our computers pretty much that only know to do what we tell them, because they simply step through a whole bunch of steps. They just follow this set of instructions and then they stop. And that's what Turing proposed, and it's an incredibly powerful thing, and it's come to utterly dominate our society and also our cognition and the way we think about the world as a result. But right back in like a couple of his original papers in 38 and 39, Turing mentioned on the side that like another type of computer was possible, which he called the Oracle machine. And he said the Oracle machine would, he wasn't going to say much about it except that it couldn't be a machine. And you're like, thanks, Alan. But what he meant was, and he does explain it a little bit later, is that the Oracle machine would be a machine that had communications with the outside world, that simply didn't operate in this step-by-step process, that at some point asked something outside itself to engage in its deliberations, its discussions, its forms of thinking. And people have tried to build Oracle machines for some time. Stafford Beer, the guy I just mentioned, building like pond computers and various other strange things is one example of them. But I have no idea if this is what your question was about. But like, it seemed to me to be hitting on one of the most fascinating things, which is this idea that intelligence, that what we might gain from intelligence will be gained from multiple forms of intelligence and communities of intelligence and diversities of intelligence, rather than a single vision of mostly human and mostly white, male, North American, etc., intelligence as being like the true definition of it. But that anything interesting that comes of it will come out of multi-species relationship and true diversities of relationships and this acknowledgement of an infinite ways of kind of doing and being things in the world.
James Bridle, Anya Obminska,